Okay, I'm here today with my dad because my grandparents, two of them don't speak English, and the other one's very sick, and the other one is out of the state. So I'm using my dad. Um, Dad, when were you born?
I was born in January 1981.
Okay, so you were part of the Cold War era.
Yes, I was in.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Detroit and Sterling Heights, Michigan.
What was the first time you remember hearing about the Soviet Union and its conflict with the United States? Like, did you hear it at school?
Yep, I heard it at school probably the first time, and I learned a lot about it in grade school.
Do you remember hearing or thinking about communism?
Yeah, I do. In fact, my grandfather, who was born in Italy, was born into communism, so very familiar with communism, and he was part of World War II, so Italy was run by a dictator, so very familiar with communism.
Do you remember like living or experiencing any events that took place during the Cold War? Like on the news?
You know, I don't remember everything because towards the end of, I was born closer to the later part of the Cold War, so, Reagan was elected. I do remember the events in the late 80s, probably 1989, where the Berlin Wall was taken down. The Berlin Wall was it was a big deal. I remember the president on TV saying, take that wall down. So I remember a lot of communist governments fell in the late 80s, 89, 90. Germany became independent. I believe Poland, Hungary, and there was another, maybe Bulgaria, another Eastern European country was became independent.
Do you remember like how your parents reacted to these events? Because obviously they were earlier.
Well, my parents were really involved, and they were always watching the news and learning about this because they had a lot of family that lives in Europe. And they were affected by that.
Let's see here. Do you remember about like the bomb, nuclear testing, or radiation, or anything like that?
Yeah, I remember learning about that. Back in the late 50s, early 60s, the Soviet Union, also known as USSR, were testing their first and largest nuclear weapon ever. So I remember learning about that. In the 50s, in the early 50s, the USSR was testing their first atomic weapon. At the same time, the United States was testing their first hydrogen bomb. And then in the late 60s, USSR, Soviet Union, finally tested their first large nuclear weapon. So I do remember that, learning about that.
That's interesting. Were you or any of your family members ever afraid that there would be a hot war or a nuclear war between the United States and Soviet Union?
Yeah, my dad told me the story like back in 1983, and I sort of remember the name. I think it was called Able Archer, where the U.S. was testing, was doing testing and military drills, and Russia, or I shouldn't say Russia, it's USSR, thought that the United States was preparing to go to war, and it escalated very quickly. I think that was in 1983. So at that time, I thought for sure, my family thought for sure that we were going to go to war.
Did you guys prepare for it?
No, I mean, we didn't really prepare for it, just because we felt pretty safe where we live here in the United States, but my parents were concerned, but I was too young to be drafted, so they weren't that concerned.
So do you remember anything about like the space race?
Yeah, the space race was actually pretty interesting. The space race was late 50s, I think 1957 or 58, where it was actually pretty cool. It was United States and Russia or USSR were trying to be the first person to land somebody in space. So there was a lot of new technological advances. They were building rockets, so it was a really big deal. So they were trying to they wanted to be the first one to put somebody in space.
Oh, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm. The bad part about that is they actually started building rockets. It was very interesting. They started with rockets and then eventually started building missiles because of it. So
yes, that was also in Cuba, Cuban Missile Crisis, but that was later. So how do you think the rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union promoted in sports, like Olympics?
It made a really big deal because Russia, every nation is proud and they want, their nation to do well, but there was such conflict during the Cold War between those two countries that everybody wanted their country to win, and it was because we weren't going to war, we were, sort of at war, but you wanted to, if you beat them in any sport and you won a medal, it was like winning.
Yeah.
And so it was a really, really big deal. I remember, the U.S. hockey team beating, Russia, and it was a really big, or Soviet Union, I keep saying Russia, it was a big deal. So, but it was very important for each country to win. It was very prideful to win against the United States and vice versa.
Interesting. How do you think future generations will remember the Cold War, and what lessons should students take away from the Cold War? Can
you say that again?
Yes.
Again? That's a long question.
How do you think future generations will remember the Cold War?
Well, the crazy part about the Cold War is it lasted from 1945 all the way to 1990.
Yeah.
And so many things happened in between, and it was the first time where, force wasn't necessarily used between the U.S. and Russia, but so many things were implemented along the way to kind of hurt each other's, economies. So I think a lot happened in that time, and I think I think it's interesting, and I think a lot of people will want to, will remember a lot of things that happened in between. I mean, you have to remember, that was the end of World War II when it started, and that's basically when the first atomic bomb was dropped in Japan.
Yeah.
And that was in 1945. And then all those things happened in between. There was several wars in between, the big ones being the Korean War. We had back in the 1960s, President Kennedy was elected. 3 years later, he was assassinated. In between that, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was the Berlin Wall that was built. There was a lot of things that had happened in between. Then, North Korea, I believe North Korea invaded South Korea. And then, so there was all kinds of things that happened in between, back, and then even at that time, in 1969, Apollo 11 landed on the moon, or landed in space. So there was all kinds of stuff that had happened, going all the way down to the Berlin Wall being torn down, and then in the late 90s, and then in early 90s, 91, basically the Cold War ended, but the Soviet Empire basically declined. So I think it's very interesting. There's a lot that people will remember, but there was a lot of events that happened in between.
Yes, I agree. Okay, this is more like a question for now. What is your position today on nuclear arms race?
My position on it is, it's important, I guess, to have as a last resort, but nuclear war is the worst thing that could possibly happen. So the problem with nuclear arms race is if nuclear weapons are in the wrong hands, millions and millions of people will die, and the fallout from radiation would you know, it would ruin. It would basically be the end of the world. So it's a very scary time because, you know, there's a lot of people that want to harm different countries for their own political and religious reasons. It's a very scary time.
Well, do you think it's possible that a nuclear war could happen right now?
Very possible.
Really?
Yep, I think there's
Gosh.
still unfortunately some dictators in this world, and you know, and they constantly threaten nuclear war, but if pushed in a corner, it could possibly happen.
How do you think we should protect our national security now, like to prevent that?
Well, I think they should do it diplomatically to try to negotiate, negotiate through the conflicts as opposed to, you know, bombing other countries and
Yeah.
being involved in different wars. I think there has to be some type of, diplomatic